All right, we'll be starting here in just a minute. Alrighty, if I can have everyone's attention, please. I'd like to introduce Dave Hirsch, and he's with the Securities and Exchange Commission. So he's here to talk about some stuff that's way over my head, so I'll go ahead and let him take over. It's the second time I've done that today.
I project, but maybe not that well. Well, thank you, everybody, for attending. I'd ask you to please hold your tomatoes till the end. Might not be the most popular person at this conference, but I very much appreciate. I very much appreciate everyone being here and giving me the opportunity to talk to you. I think it's a super interesting conference. It's great to see so many people interested in the space. At the SEC, we're obviously very interested in the space as well. I thought I was going to slide that one by you. Before I get started, I have to say this every time I speak publicly. The Securities and Exchange Commission disclaims responsibility for any private publication or statement of any SEC employee or commissioner, me. The speech expresses the author's views, does not necessarily reflect those of the commission, the commissioners, or other members of the staff. So a little bit about myself. I'm an attorney. I started in private practice in Los Angeles many years ago, left that to start my own company as a private investigation firm, specializing in consumer fraud, antitrust, and securities fraud. So I come to the SEC about 2.5 years ago with kind of a unique perspective. I don't know that they've hired a lot of private investigators there, and certainly not a lot of entrepreneurs. And I think that experience has been very helpful for me in my work as an investigator, and particularly my work in this space. And when I first joined the SEC, living in Texas, I'm in the Fort Worth regional office, I was really surprised. I'd meet people on the street or out in public and tell them I worked for the SEC, and they were super interested. They couldn't wait to talk to me about it. And it struck me as odd at first, but gradually I learned that they thought it was some other SEC. And when it turned out I couldn't get them tickets, their interest level went down significantly. So at the SEC, I'm in the enforcement division. I've been working in crypto-related investigations since about 2015, so relatively early for a government lawyer. Got a decent understanding of it for a government lawyer, which is a terrible understanding for an engineer, but we do the best we can. I'm the cyber liaison for the Fort Worth regional office. The SEC in October of 2017 rolled out a cyber unit. We're focused on investigating hacking for material non-public information or hacking of publicly traded companies, bad actors on a dark web who can impact individuals, investors, and also distributed ledger technology and cryptocurrencies, ICOs. I'm a part of the dark web working group and also the digital ledger technology working group. So something about the SEC, we're a little bit of a hybrid organization. We are both civil law enforcement and a regulatory body. And we have three complementary but sometimes competing obligations. And that is we protect investors, we maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and we also facilitate capital formation. And I say those are sometimes competing because you could imagine a framework through which we protect investors perfectly by never allowing any change, never allowing anything new. Great protection, terrible for facilitating capital formation. Alternatively, we could just say we're not going to touch any of this stuff. It's going to be what it's going to be. Potentially great for facilitating capital formation in the short term, not great for protecting investors, and I would argue not great for facilitating capital formation in the long term. I think smart regulation and smart enforcement will go a long way towards helping the markets grow in a smart way, and I'll talk more about that as we go. So as I said, I work in the enforcement division, and our goal is to protect investors, and the way we do that is by investigating and litigating potential violations. Those violations can take a number of forms. It can be outright fraud, scams, exit scams, things like that. It can also just be failing to register. If you're offering a security in the United States, you have to register with the SEC. There's a rule under the 33 Act, the Securities and Exchange Act of 1933, put in place after the terrible stock market fall of '29, that says if you're going to offer a security, it has to be registered. Similarly, if you're going to run an exchange, that's supposed to be registered under a different rule of the 33 Act. So the way we focus on protecting investors in the enforcement division, and I should, again reiterate, I'm an enforcement lawyer, so I'm not a policy guy. I've got my own ideas about policy. They're definitely not necessarily the SEC's. None of these ideas necessarily belong to the SEC, but certainly my policy ideas are my own. And most of my work focuses on enforcement and protection of investors. And the way we try and protect investors is we demand that if you're going to offer a security, if you're going to offer what's called an investment contract, which is treated like a security, you have to register with the SEC. And the reason you have to register with the SEC, the underlying kind of ethos behind this policy, is to provide full and clear disclosures to your investors. So kind of a play on when Lambo for the ICO market, it's how many Lambo. It's you need to tell your investors how many Lamborghinis you plan to buy with the proceeds they give you to create your new ICO. I'm only half joking. You need to be able to provide them a clear sense of the risks involved in what you're doing. Have you built something yet? Does it work? Who are your attorneys? Who are your accountants? Where do you do your banking? How can you provide your investors some sense of accountability, some sense of who you are in the real world, such that if something goes wrong, they have someone to look to try and make things right? And it doesn't go just to being honest with them. There's also the obligation not to omit material information. So if you've been convicted of multiple felonies for lying and cheating and stealing, there's case law that says your investors have a right to know that. So you have to not just be forthright about the things you do say, but you have to tell them things that they'd want to know. You can't omit material information. One of the strange things in the United States in particular is that for virtual currency, jurisdiction is shared by multiple regulatory bodies. So the SEC, the CFTC, the IRS all have their own distinct area of regulation, and also there's some overlapping areas of regulation and jurisdiction. And that is complex in some ways, but I think it also provides a level of resilience and robustness because you have a bunch of different agencies all looking to try and protect people and all coming at it from a slightly different perspective. So for the SEC, for example, in I think 2013, we litigated a case against somebody running a Ponzi scheme who told people, hey, give me your Bitcoin. I've got local people who will pay me cash for it in person, and I will generate 1% to 7% daily returns for you. So basically, give me your Bitcoin and I'm going to turn it into gold. It turned out he was going to take it to the casino, and he was not particularly good at that and lost all his investors' money. And for us to have jurisdiction, the first argument needs to be, is this a security or is this an investment contract? And the first prong of that analysis for us is, was there an investment of money? And so this defendant, a guy named Trendon Shavers, came to court with his lawyer and said, SEC, you don't have jurisdiction. Even if I did something wrong, you aren't the ones to tell me so because there was no investment of money. You fail on the first prong. And we argued to the court, although it's never been described before, Bitcoin is the equivalent of money, and this is a flexible standard. And so for our purposes, for jurisdictional analysis, if you're investing Bitcoin, it's just like you're investing money for determining whether the SEC gets to talk about this. And the court concluded that was right. CFTC ruled in a derivative order in 2015 that Bitcoins can be commodities, depending on the particular circumstance in which they're used. The IRS, as I assume many of you know, or will soon, because I'm going to say so, views cryptocurrencies as property. And therefore, they say, you need to report it as you report disposition of any property. If you've got a gain, you're supposed to report that to them. If you've got a loss, you can claim that on your taxes. That's not tax advice. So with ICOs in particular, but virtual currencies generally, looking back at the ethos of the Bitcoin white paper and some of the stuff that even preceded it, there is a strong sense that anonymity is helpful. That one of the goals of this is to be able to have a system where you can be anonymous, or at least pseudonymous. And I understand that, and I respect that, but I think there is some tension there. And it's a spectrum, and where you don't want to allow the value of anonymity to overwhelm the obligation for accountability. And particularly when you're taking people's money to build something. When you're saying, I need your money for capital formation. I want to create a new company. I'm going to build a platform. I'm going to build an ecosystem. To do that in a way that's anonymous leaves your investors lacking some fundamental understanding and some ability to actually try and reach you if there's a problem. So anytime you're dealing with investments, and part of the reasons we require registration is to provide that level of accountability. And I don't think that and again, it's me personally speaking, the advent of a new technology, even an impressive new technology, wipes out that fundamental obligation. You're taking people's money with the idea that you're going to be able to return them more money later, or that the value of what you're giving them now is going to increase because of something you're going to do. You need to be accountable to that, and I don't really understand how you can be accountable if you're also anonymous. The last point for this particular part of the presentation is that fraud hurts individuals but threatens whole markets. So if you allow fraud to exist, an individual may lose money, but if fraud becomes prevalent in the market, you're going to at least slow down the expansion of that market. What is super interesting about what has happened with virtual currencies, with ICOs, is the rapid rate of adoption, the rapid increase in value. But that's a double-edged sword. I mean, it certainly brought a lot of new people, maybe some folks in this room, who are interested in trying to pursue this, who have what's described on Reddit as FOMO, fear of missing out. People want to come in, invest, and try and make money. But to the extent that these new adopters lose their shirts, to the extent they lose money rapidly because of exit scams, because of unfulfilled promises, because of folks in another jurisdiction who can't be reached to return money if the project never gets built, overall, if the ICO world becomes associated just with fraud or crime or illicit behavior, that's going to slow adoption. It's going to decrease the rate of development. It's going to make what you currently own less valuable over time. And so I think it's incumbent on everybody in the market to try and marginalize people committing fraud. And one of the ways to do that is by contacting me or contacting somebody at the SEC. So a lot of the way we find those violations that we're going to, or alleged violations that we're going to investigate and potentially litigate, is by people coming forward with tips, complaints, and referrals. And we, like every governmental agency, are limited in our resources. So we probably can't investigate every tip we get. We can look at it and try and put it on a spectrum of where we can devote our resources. But can we do a full litigation against every tip we get? Probably not. But the more tips we get, the better the pool is, the more we can try and pick those where either there's a significant risk of investor harm, where there's an opportunity to help inform the market generally, that a regulator is out here and watching the market and trying to make it better, communicating to investors how to ask better questions, and generally trying to inform the market. So I'd encourage people, if they find things in the market that smell fishy, that look like they're frauds, look like they're scams, that aren't registered but probably should be, please shoot me an email, give me a call, contact the SEC. If you love dad jokes, I'd encourage you to sign up for @FortWorth_SEC. That is our Twitter feed. I'm not responsible for it, but I am a regular chuckler at it, and the person who runs it does provide a shocking amount of dad jokes.
Is there a database of registered securities for us to check for?
There is. And you can go to investor.gov. And if you go to investor.gov today, on the front page, pretty much the first bright link you'll see is information about ICOs. This is something that Chairman Clayton, the head of the SEC, has been speaking about publicly frequently. He's been out in front of the Senate Banking Committee, I believe it was last week, alongside the chairman of the CFTC, the Commodities and Futures Trading Commission, talking about the importance of regulation and of registration for these types of investments.
Can you come again? What is the name of the link?
It's investor.gov. And there's a lot of great resources on there. There are press releases about some recent actions we've taken. There's questions you can ask before you invest your money in a particular offering. The focus of the commission and of the chairman is very much on protecting mom and pop investors. And there's a lot of opportunity for them to lose their money in the current context. And we've got a lot of focus on trying to help educate them, help provide resources. So if there are problems, we get there first. And one of the unfortunate parts about the technology involved is typically once the money is committed, very hard for any regulator or any law enforcement to get that money back. It's just so mobile and so easy to put it someplace either anonymous or offshore and extra-jurisdictional or otherwise hard to trace, that unless we catch it on the front end, it's very hard for us to protect investors. Not like there's a bank we can go to get the money back.
So is there data of existing or history of scams or frauds for ICOs that people can check out? And other kind of scams?
Yeah, and I'll tell you about a few. There's not necessarily a database of them, but there are press releases. So the SEC, how many of you know about the DAO that happened in the summer of 2016? So some, but not all. So very quickly, the DAO was an idea put forth. DAO is DAO, Decentralized Autonomous Organization. It was promoted in the summer of 2016. People would exchange Ether tokens for DAO tokens. The idea was to have a computerized organization with no leadership, where people would just vote on investments using their DAO tokens. And if those investments were successful, they would enjoy profits or returns in proportion to how many DAO tokens they'd invested. Interesting idea. Unfortunately, it never really got off the ground. They raised a lot more money than they anticipated. I think their initial goal was $15 million, and they raised like $150 million in a very short time frame. Got a lot of publicity, but before they ever got to the stage of actually promoting a particular investment or investing in anything, somebody realized that their smart contract was not actually that smart. It had a flaw that allowed you to withdraw more money than you'd put in, and somebody went away with $65 million out of the thing. Ether was still in its infancy at the time, and the folks behind Ether decided it was better to do a soft fork and put all the investors back into the position they were in before they'd given money to the DAO. So it ended up not having a ton of investor harm, but was a clear sign that there might be a problem in the market. The SEC, and I did not work on this, took a very deliberative approach. And a year later, this past July 25th, 2017, and again, this is available on investor.gov, issued what's called a 21A report. And that is basically an announcement that we could have brought an enforcement action, but we choose not to, but we want to publicly talk about it. I think that was the first 21A report in 3 or 4 years. It's a very rarely used tool, but potentially an important one. I think it was important in this case. It was important for a couple of reasons. One, it's an opportunity to tell the market what the SEC views about ICOs. Up until then, there had not been a lot of public statements out of the SEC, and so we could sort of understand why people thinking about how they're going to structure things were operating a bit in the dark. And this is a chance to help clarify our stance as to our jurisdiction and what we might do. It was also helpful because it laid out in very clear detail the analysis we would put through to try and determine whether an ICO falls within our jurisdiction and whether it potentially violates the securities laws. And it's premised on something called the Howey test. And the Howey test is basically issued by the Supreme Court. It was a litigation from 1940s involving an orange grove. So the least technology savvy or forward thing you can think of, but it analogizes forwards to all sorts of things. So in the Howey test, the court said, if there is an investment of money with the expectation of profits based on the efforts of a third party, that's the equivalent of a security. And if you have all of those elements, then that's a security and it needs to be registered with the SEC. And so for the DAO report, the SEC went through a similar analysis and said people invested Ethereum or DAO tokens. Well, that's the equivalent of money, so prong one was satisfied. With the expectation of profits, definitely. The whole thing was the idea that people would pool their money to invest with the idea they'd get returns when those investments worked out. The third prong was a more difficult one, which is based on the efforts of a third party. I mean, the DAO had marketed itself as if no third party would be involved. It was just an autonomous, computerized thing where people only voted with their particular DAO tokens. But in our analysis, we looked more deeply than that and said both there was a group of people who promoted the thing. They published the white paper. They were out in media trying to attract investment and attract money. So that's effort by a third party. And also, they had a group of curators, like super users, who were defined in advance, and it was those people who would first decide, is this an investment something that we would ever allow people to vote on within the DAO? And that combination also showed efforts of a third party, and based on that, we said we could have brought an enforcement action here. We choose not to because there wasn't really investment harm as a result of the soft fork, and because we hadn't really been out in public talking about it. And our goal is not to surprise promoters or surprise investors. It's to have a dialogue and make people aware of where we view the market, and so when we bring an enforcement action, you understand why we're doing it. Since then, there have been several additional enforcement actions. One was a settlement with a company called Munchie that was a restaurant review site that wanted to have its own token to raise capital for their iPhone and Android app, and that I had in its promotion the idea that you would get a return on these tokens. These tokens would become more valuable when the platform was built out. So again, now we have investment of money to buy the Munchie token. With the expectation of profits, the tokens will become more valuable. Based on the efforts of a third party, Munchie builds out the network. So that satisfies the Howey test. It's an investment contract, should be registered with us, and wasn't. We got in touch with Munchie before they'd actually issued the tokens, and they agreed, okay, we're not going to actually release the tokens. We're going to give everybody their money back. And so rather than bring an enforcement action that would have penalties and disgorgement and be an expensive process for everybody, we settled with them. We issued a cease and desist, say don't do this again, and walked away fairly clean.
One question. So essentially, it was a great presentation, especially when it comes to the SEC. We would like to know what is happening in your space. One question I want to ask is, we all agree that you are protecting the interest of the common investor. However, what is happening is there are some good ideas where the non-accredited investors are not able to participate. They would be able to participate only once the token hits the exchange. Is there a way out? Because as individual non-accredited investors, many of them are losing the opportunity to get into the early.
It's a great question, and I don't have a great answer for it. I think it's such a new market that we're still trying to come up with the appropriate solutions. The regime that we have now, where if you have a company and you want to capitalize it, you either have to register or you have to qualify for an exemption. And there are exemptions out there where you can market to a limited number of folks to enable you to generate a modest amount of capital. Or you qualify through another kind of crowdfunding type thing, but then you have to use an intermediary to do some of the raising. So there are exemptions available, but there is not a new set of rules specifically for ICOs. And if there were to be, I think that would require some guidance from Congress, and that guidance has not been forthcoming.
So what percentage of the M funds can be raised from non-accredited investors?
I don't know off the top of my head, I think, but the rules for the exemptions are available on investor.gov.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sorry. The number of ICO tokens that have actually been registered with us is 0 at this point. But hopefully that will. I don't believe so, but again, I'm in enforcement and so not in the Corp Fin. Jerry, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, so in the SEC's recent announcement about their enforcement priorities for 2018, they mentioned 3 areas of tokens that they're looking at. One was ICOs. One was secondary market dynamics, right? So I get a lot of brain damage thinking about, okay, let's say you comply with the issuance. How do you comply with secondary market responsibilities as an issuer of a potential security? I know it's a broad question. I understand. Has there been any thought about how the secondary market compliance dynamic exists?
I'm sure there has. I think that's an investment in markets, and unfortunately, as an enforcement lawyer, that's not yet been my focus. Part of it is make sure you're doing it with exchanges that are registered, and right now there really aren't a whole lot of those, if any. Sorry.
Dave, in the beginning you talked about a lawsuit that you got with the gambling, and you talked about the different government groups there. You had the IRS yourself, and how you guys interpret it as one interprets it as commodity, one is can you talk a little bit about help us understand a little better, because that's the frustrating part, right? We all think this is basically an asset in a sense, but it's confusing when you're talking about it maybe being a prong, hitting the money prong, commodity, and then asset.
I can. I'm not really well suited to speak for any other agency. So for us, Bitcoin itself, we've never taken an enforcement action specifically as to Bitcoin. We've never declared Bitcoin is a security. Not saying we never would, but we've never done that to date. But other things like the Munchie token, and recently we brought an enforcement action against something called a Rise Bank. To the extent that you are taking an asset and you're trying to market it to people with the idea that they are going to earn a profit from it, and a profit doesn't necessarily have to be dividends or distributions or cash payments. It can just be the idea that it will appreciate in value because of something the promoters are going to do. Then that starts to sound like an investment contract, and that is an area where we will establish jurisdiction. The CFTC treats it a little bit differently. I mean, to the extent you think of it like digital gold, if there's buying and selling of gold, then there are rules about how you go about doing that, and the CFTC enforces those rules. It's not necessarily an investment where you're planning on seeing an appreciation based on the efforts of a third party, but it is an exchange of asset values and therefore a commodity, and then there are rules that the CFTC has.
For us, at least, I think we want to do the right thing. Maybe some people in the back don't, I don't know. But I think we want to do the right thing, but it's frustrating when you have 3 different sections of the government. So, and you're actually likable, so I appreciate it. You did a great presentation, but that's the kind of things that I think we want, make you guys aware of. It's frustrating for us.
Yeah, I get that, but I think it's also helpful in that none of us could just one day wake up and be like, you know what, this is complicated and time consuming, we want no more of it. ICOs, nope. Like there's no universal regulator in the US. And so the downside of that is you do have some interplay among them, and there's some complexity in how you comply with everybody's obligations. The upside is there's some interplay between the agencies, and no one has the universal authority to just come out and do something that would be damaging to the market as a whole.
All right, we can take one more question. Gray shirt right here in the 3rd row.
Hey.
So I'm curious. So if you have a foreign bank account with more than $10,000, this may be an IRS question, but you have to acknowledge it to the IRS. If you have some money, or you have coins on something like Binance, which is an overseas exchange, does the IRS or does the SEC see that as foreign property or a foreign bank account? Do you have to disclose that at the end of the year to the IRS or the relevant regulatory body?
Pass? No, I'm sorry. I'm not the IRS, and so it would be very difficult for me to answer that question. I'm sorry.
All right, we can do one more.
Hi, I'm an RIM registered person. I'm familiar with the rules and the regulations, and you did a fantastic presentation to be able to, very funny. It's very difficult presentation. So my thought is I had a lot of my clients asking me about cryptocurrency, and I said, guys, okay, I'm going to have to figure this out. So I'm setting up a crypto hedge fund. One of the LPs, as I spoke to lawyers, has to be overseas. So it's not to evade SEC, but it has to be. I want to know your thought on that.
I think that gets into both investments and investment markets, which sets those rules, and policy, and that's a little beyond my understanding. So I don't really have I don't want to say something that isn't right, so I don't really have a great opinion on that. I'm sorry. Well, thank you guys very much. I'm going to be around all day. Please come see me, say hello. Thank you.
Everyone give it up for Dave. He did a wonderful job, as this gentleman said, boiling down such a dense subject in only 24 minutes, as Jerry did also. So give it up for these guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
And I'm just going to go ahead and let everyone know we will be reconvening in this room at 1:10 for the Ken Palm ICO compliance presentation.